On Earth, down in Johannesburg, South Africa, a species would appear over the city and then do absolutely nothing for 3 months. As humanity waited for the doors to open to reveal what sort of creatures had found our planet, the wait became too agonizing. Eventually, humanity would draw a collective consensus on the matter and say, screw it, cut it open. These aliens don't want to come down here and hang out, we'll just go up there. Upon doing so, however, we wouldn't find some blindingly intelligent race with gray skin and big eyes. Instead, the insertion team would come across what appeared to be a refugee situation. The species affectionately known as prawns, or at least in a derogatory way, would be brought down to the surface as humans attempted to feed the cat food addicts. But as always, when dealing with another species, you should really figure out if there's any compatibility issues concerning contagious diseases. One man in particular would find out the hard way when serving eviction notices to the alien refugees. So in today's episode, we'll discuss the species, where they came from, their physiology, and why they appear massively more powerful than humans, and also what may have actually happened to them, because this disease that afflicts our boy on Earth seems to have maybe caused the same issues in the first place for this species. And also, fun fact, the language spoken by the prawns was created by rubbing the surface of a pumpkin. But first, this episode is sponsored by NordVPN. Are you ready to take back control of your internet with NordVPN today? Well, if you aren't, too bad, because people are going goblin mode for your info. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount with an additional month free if you go to nordvpn.com/Roanoke, and considering it's risk-free for 30 days, if you aren't satisfied, you can get your money back guaranteed. So what are they offering? Well, with threat protection, it steps up your cybersecurity, shielding you from the effects of malicious sites, downloads, trackers, and intrusive ads. Even if you aren't connected to a VPN, it's still keeping an eye out for these issues. On top of that, with its double protection changing your IP address twice to cover web traffic, encrypted servers protecting your data, and the ability to link up with over 5,400 servers in 59 countries, you can appear all over the planet, stopping others from tracking your actual location. And even by doing this, the ultra-fast connection means that you don't have to sacrifice speed for better security, as NordVPN gives you both. If all that sounds good, then heading to nordvpn.com/Roanoke, you can pick yourself up a 2-year plan with an additional month free at a huge discount today. All right, let's get back to it. So we kick off our story with a bunch of interviews and our main boy, Vicus, who's about to basically catch what amounts to space herpes. He basically recaps, along with a lot of others, of what I just mentioned at the beginning about humanity was cutting open the ships like ultra chads. But when we did this, they found a species having quite a few issues and extremely malnourished. They were aimless, seemingly having no direction on what to do. So the temporary holding zone became a slum, with the aliens being strictly carnivorous and enjoying meat. Humans at this point started to get rather annoyed at the alien species because they just did like mega crimes. We get some information about one ship falling from the mothership way earlier, but it was never found. As the alien species spent more time on Earth, they would build their own forms of force multipliers, which make human lead throwers look like we were basically using rocks and spears. The takeaway here is that humans bad, aliens worse. In response to this, the MNU, which is a literal force multiplier dealer, would begin raiding the alien slums in order to issue evictions to move them from one area that's far away from the city. Really, they were doing this because they can't access the alien technology, so there was no need for the aliens to stay there. As the interviews continue, we get the hint that Vicus is wanted for something, and also really not that well liked by the military dudes, being sent in with him as he mentions bringing less ammunition. Bureaucracy, am I right? On the ride over, Vicus dons his vest to protect his intestines, which you will actually see it's probably not that useful, but his intern gets none, as Vicus tells him that he'll be fine. So he's actually a little bit of a coward, but what can you do? Entering the prawn area, we see several are armed and others are tearing animals apart. Exiting the vehicle, they immediately get lead on them as prawns are jumping across rooftops at the human movement. Basically, it's working raid style at this point. Vicus goes to serve papers and the prawns are a little upset. They seem to be able to understand English perfectly, which now we get to the first example of their strength. As we'll call them Peacekeeper, approaches one of the prawns to show solidarity by pointing his barrel at him to indicate friendship. The prawn misreads this friendliness and grabs the Peacekeeper's arm, kicks him in the chest, and then just completely rips the arm off, which that kind of hurts. This forces the hands of the other humans as they light him up. Vicus throws cat food cans, which distracts them, which we'll actually discuss all that later. As Vicus continues on his task, he begins bribing prawns to sign with cat food. It seems some prawns understand eviction, however, while others really just don't grasp the concept. Also, just so you know, this is Mass Effect rules out here, so humans are definitely hooking up with the prawns. Garrus Vicarian, is that you? And I'm also going to be using that later when it comes to the Space Bro. Later, Vicus finds eggs in a shack illegally. The prawns can reproduce asexually, and permits are required for for them to reproduce, and as you can tell, this is to stop their population from growing completely out of control. They light up the eggs on fire as they pop like popcorn. So the raid continues as normal, busting prawns on handhelds, destroying popcorn eggs, and discussion of how alien tech won't work with humans as it's linked directly to prawn DNA. Later we meet Christopher Johnson, which is hilarious because he's an alien, but we'll call him Garrus, and the little one is known as CJ. And then also expendable friend number 1 is there. They're searching piles of trash for their own technology. Their tech contains some sort of juice allowing them to use it and nobody else. Opening the tech, the liquid pours out and then is condensed to create some sort of fuel. Garrus has been at it for over 20 years calibrating this exact amount needed, and today of all days, the evictions are being served. That kind of sucks. As Vicus goes to serve the papers, Garrus tells expendable friend to be polite, which he isn't, which rustles the jimmies of Vicus, who now thinks that they have something. He finds their chemistry set as Vicus walks around and then begins finding out their tech. He eventually finds the fuel, accidentally opens it, and gets sprayed in the face, which would kind of be alarming. It knocks him back at first, but he bags and tags it for the lab. Vicus goes on to find the other handhelds in the shack as the prawn says it's not his. So it looks like there's already so much being shared between our species, like the ability to lie with a straight face. So expendable friend then gets mad and starts throwing around humans like toddlers in a bar fight as the colonel comes up and domes the prawn. Vicus decides to go against getting help for his wounds even though his arm may be broken. Garrus returns back to CJ and tells him to go play outside in the slum as the evictions continue. As Vicus approaches, he talks to CJ, who then throws something at him, like an empty can of cat food, I'm pretty sure. Garrus then comes out as Vicus serves him the eviction notice. Garrus protests, saying that they need to give him 24 hours and that this is illegal, indicating that he's a little smarter than the rest. Vicus then threatens to take away CJ as he doesn't have a permit, but actually Garrus does. So then he just basically extorts him. As Vicus enters the shack, he spots all the computer parts and then begins vomiting. They decide to leave for now as Vicus has taken ill. On the way back, Vicus starts getting super hungry and then stops off at Gunter's for some food. As he eats, black goo begins dripping out of his nose, which probably isn't a good sign. Back at his cubicle, he continues to look pretty bad. As he sits there, he loses an entire fingernail, then heads to the bathroom and begins popping off more fingernails, which indicates his meat suit is falling apart. Back in the slums, Garrus and CJ look for the cylinder but can't find it anywhere. We also now see the extent of the cat food addiction. The prawns will literally sell war mechs for 100 cans of food, but humans can't use the tech anyways. Also, people apparently eat the prawns as well because they think that it'll cure their diseases. So now it'll probably just give you some unknown disease. So speaking of disease, as Vicus returns home, he feels like absolute crap. His wife greets him for a surprise party as that commences. His father-in-law then chews his ass out for losing a few peacekeepers, as then they start to cut up the cake. And this honestly seems like the worst party imaginable, like super boring. Like the aesthetic of it seems horrible. Anyways, so Vicus then throws up all over the cake and is brought to the hospital. As the doctor cuts off his bandage, it reveals that he now has a monster hand, or an alien hand. Either way, he's pretty alarmed. So the doctor does the right thing and then runs off. Shortly after, the MNU shows up to keep him warm by putting in what I assume is like a body bag, basically. Obviously, Vicus's wife would be a little upset and then goes to check on him but can't get through as Vicus is then wheeled away for testing. Being brought through a lab, they are poking and prodding his gross arm, seeing really what is up with him. They find the cylinder in his jacket, which apparently he forgot to check in for some reason, and then they spray him with a hose because why not? And as they bring him back to the back labs, there are several prawns being torn apart. They test his arm to find that the nerves have fused with the prawn arm as his father-in-law watches. Man, that guy sucks. Using his arm, they find he's able to operate the prawn technology while no other human was able to do this. They tell him to pull the trigger on stuff, but he won't do it for some reason. I didn't really understand this part. They test several different variants of prawn handhelds before bringing in another prawn. They use his human hand and also find that he can still pull the trigger with that, indicating that prawn DNA has become integrated into almost all of his body, even if it hasn't changed. He then blows apart the prawn in a test that seems a little excessive. As the higher-ups discuss what to do, they elect for harvesting him as nobody has ever survived the process. Vicus asks his father-in-law for help, but he does the right thing and tells his daughter that he has a disease that he got from hooking up with prawns. As they go to cut open Vicus, he hulks out and breaks free, taking the surgeon as hostage before escaping out into the hallway. Then the worst father-in-law in existence is told of the escape as Vicus continues to make said escape. Attempting to go home, it's not happening. Vicus begins calling everyone he can, but really nobody is too keen on helping him, so he's on his own. Heading back to Gunter's, things are about to get a whole lot worse. Ordering some food, a news report comes out saying that Vicus has contracted a highly contagious STD because of prolonged Mass Effect interactions with aliens in District 9, basically ruining his reputation and ensuring that everyone thinks he's a terrible person. So now nobody will serve him food. food. But I mean, technically concerning his newly acquired disease, if there's anything I've learned from Mass Effect, it's that the enzymes don't match up, and because of that, you can go all natural, it doesn't matter. So now Vicus knows he's basically screwed out there, as everyone is looking for him. So he goes to the only one place where nobody will likely look for him, Prawn Central. He gets to an evicted shack and then settles down for the night. The next morning, the prawns are up bright and early, scavenging. It has now been 40 hours since his exposure. Finding a bit of cat food, he eats a snack and then heads outside, much to the confusion of the prawns. He heads to a meat shack, which is also confusing to the cooks. He asks for a burger, but all they have is just cow meat and cat food. He starts chowing down on the cat food and then realizes that it's cat food, so it's pretty gross. Also, his teeth begin falling out, which is a maximum bra moment. His wife now calls him. He attempts to explain to her that he doesn't have a boy toy who's a prawn, and that his father-in-law has lied to her. Considering he told her that he was gone anyway, she probably needs to listen and follow the clues here. She says that she doesn't want him to hold her anymore and then hangs up on him. Why did you call in the first place? I don't know. Heading down to the meat shack, he grabs the hatchet and then cuts one of his monster fingers off, which as you might imagine is probably pretty painful. So he decides that really isn't the best idea. As he looks out on the horizon though, a team of humans has arrived to hunt him down. Running to his shack, well, if it isn't Garrus Vicarian once more. Garrus tells him to get out of his shack as Vicus looks around and sees that the computers are actually operating something before passing out from blood loss, revealing the pranification. Garrus throws him down a deep hole into the ship as he questions Vicus about the cylinder. Vicus tells him that it's back at MNU as it was confiscated. This upsets Garrus as 20 years of the academy has now been wasted. CJ spills the beans on why they need the cylinder. Garrus tells Vicus that he could have fixed them with the medical machines on the mothership and really say that 3 times fast, but now he can't as he doesn't have that fuel. So now we hear Garrus mention something that's pretty interesting, which may explain what has happened to his species. The transformation is accelerating. I'm kind of suspecting at this point that the species of prawn wasn't always like this, which we will discuss later on. Garrus says that they need to actually get into the MNU to retrieve the cylinder as it's their only option, which Vicus relents, but kind of seems to agree, but also says it's pretty much going to end them. 56 hours after exposure, the skin around Vicus's arm and his back are beginning to turn as it starts peeling away, which that hurts. Then his wife calls him once more. She says again she doesn't know what to believe, but she doesn't think he's the monster he's portrayed to be, even though he's literally turning into a monster. She questions how he can go back to normal, but as they talk, the dynamic douche duo are listening in as they have tracked his location. Back in the shack, Garrus and CJ talk about their home planet with 7 moons that apparently is bigger than Earth. However, without the fuel, they're just going to have to go to this new camp instead of their home. Vicus comes in and tells them that they really shouldn't go there, as it's a pretty bad place. He talks to the two, asking them if his arm will go back to normal if they get the fuel. Garrus says yes, but that would take them both out, so there's really no point in going there. But I mean, really, what's the other option? Vicus goes to some handheld dealers in order to obtain some offensive measures to get into the MNU. He's got money as they then bring out the leader, and unfortunately the leader is aware of who he is. They ask him where he's hiding it, and then they find his arm. The leader looks at it and sees that it's actually fused on. The leader then tells his people to cut the arm off as he wants it. Latching onto the alien tech, again, he's able to use it and takes out a few dudes. So here's the mistake. He doesn't take out the leader. The guy's like right there, which is a dumb move. The leader asks how he got that arm and that he will hunt him down as Vicus snopes out of there. And if anybody ever tells you that they're gonna hunt you down and you have a means to get rid of them right there, I mean, let's use our brain, just go ahead and get rid of them. Back at MNU, the colonel and father-in-law discuss the plan. Go in quietly and grab Vicus. As they discuss how they're going to find them, too late, Vicus has already found them. Breaking into the MNU, they have their phasers set to stun as not to take anyone out. That is until lead starts flying their way, which Vicus then takes out a guard. The prawn mentions how, well, that was a change of plans, but heading into the back, Garrus sees that his people are being torn apart for medical purposes. This is a little concerning as Vicus grabs the cylinder and Garrus just kind of stands over the body of a fellow prawn. Well, no time to mourn as soldiers the entire time are taking pot shots. Vicus is able to hold them off till Garrus gets his head back in the game. The prawn asks about a way out, which Vicus is right. He mentions how the plan was just to get in there. He had no plan to get out. Garrus then constructs a concussive force detonator and blows a hole in the wall as they escape out with a truck with the colonel and soldiers giving chase in a helicopter. Getting back to the shack, they have a bit of a falling out. Vicus asks how long it's going to take to fix his arm, which Garrus says 3 years. He has to use all the fuel to go back to his home planet and then return as he doesn't want his people being used as a medical experiment. This upsets Vicus as this is not the deal that he had, and then he knocks him out and descends into the ship himself to go get it fixed, which is extra dumb as he has no clue what the medical machines even are, what they look like, and has no ability to actually operate them. As CJ asks where the old man is, which Vicus says that he had to heroically leave him behind, I mean, what a guy, the colonel now finds Garrus and starts questioning how to open the ship hatch, which he doesn't tell him as his son is down there. But before the colonel could do anything, Vicus then takes off with the ship like a complete tool, leaving Garrus behind. At this point, CJ somewhat attacks Vicus Vicus as he sees really what's kind of going on. Now the MNU then shoots down the ship as apparently SAMs are highly effective on alien tech. Who knew? The ship then crashes once again, ruining Garrus's plan on escaping as they take him prisoner. Heading to the downed ship, the Colonel then heads inside in an attempt to take Vicus alive as CJ hides in the wires. The Colonel grabs Vicus and leads him outside, placing him in a vehicle as they are about to be third-partied. 72 hours after exposure, as they head out, a burning car is pushed in front of them as force multiplier dealers have entered the chat. They begin to attack the MNU to retrieve Vicus for his arm. They begin attacking the truck as MNU attempts to repel them but unsuccessfully. As they bring him inside, CJ calls for the mothership to come overhead as he's quite intelligent. The leader then begins telling Vicus he's basically an idiot and that they will now cut off his arm. As they hold him down to do the deed, the MNU sends more soldiers to extract him, which results in an all-out war taking place in the slums. As CJ continues to call for the ship, eventually it goes into action, letting out a sonic blast, breaking most of the windows out in the city. This automates all alien tech in the area as the dealers are all taken out, with the leader, good God, getting his entire head inflated, which seems, momentarily really painful, but I guess it really wouldn't be that painful because I suppose pretty quick. As the ship continues to fly overhead, the Colonel looks at Garrus and says he knows what's up with the ship and they need to question him. Pulling him out of the vehicle, they just sort of hit him a lot and then also throw tear gas to get Vicus to come outside. And Vicus decides nah and jumps into the war mech. At this point, it's a bloodbath. Well, it's almost a bloodbath. We'll get to that, but not before he runs like a coward, leaving Garrus behind. Definitely not Shepard behavior. The Colonel says to take out the prawn, which Vicus then hears, and then finally grows a pair and goes back for Garrus. Like, that took forever. Vicus is in a war mech and he was still scared. Like, bro, are you for real with that? Anyhow, running through, now it's a bloodbath, as everyone starts taking alien rounds to the face and becoming a blood cloud. Vicus says that he will hold them off as Garrus says he's not leaving him behind. So, literally, Garrus has way more honor than Vicus. He then promises that he will be back in 3 years, which we never get closure because there was never District 9 to District 10. But that's neither here nor there. As Garrus heads into the smaller ship, he grabs his sun thing and they begin their ascent as Vicus is getting lit up. The mothership drops a beam onto the smaller ship, bringing it up as the Colonel goes to take a pot shot at it with a rocket-propelled concussive force applicator. Vicus is able to snatch it out of the air, and before he takes the shot on the Colonel, he is hit by a car, which knocks him down. This, however, gave the smaller ship enough time to ascend into the mothership. Vicus now gets back up and begins his ultimate confrontation with the Colonel as he's ejected out of the mech. Attempting to crawl away, he watches the smaller ship dock with the mothership, completely ensuring that they made it, except for that hull breach caused by the humans cutting open the ship. As the Colonel approaches Vicus, we see he's beginning to change, with his eyes having formed into what prawn eye looks like. However, this has attracted the attention of the other prawns. They move in on him, literally tearing off the head of the Colonel and pulling him into pieces as he's made of delicious meat. Garrus then heads back to his planet, ensuring that for the next 3 years at least, Vicus is completely screwed. The city also rejoices watching the aliens leave. However, it's a little bit of an unknown if the aliens will come back to rescue Vicus, their people, or if they'll really come back to declare war on humanity. Probably war based on what Garrus would tell them. At the end, we get the interviews with one guy in particular completely screwed. Like, remember intern number 1? He literally revealed that the MNU was doing something incredibly illegal, but now he's on trial for revealing illegal activities. And he's basically been in jail since. Like, bro, what? Actually, then again, let's be real, that happens to our species all the time. So District 9 was destroyed and the aliens were transplanted elsewhere, with them continuing to reproduce, and now are 1 million stronger than they were before, having reached a population of 2.5 million. Also, Vicus keeps dropping off gifts for his wife at her front door that he continues to make after he is completely turned into a prawn. At least they won't be able to recognize him anymore, I suppose. So let's kick things off by first discussing the prawns' home world, as this will help explain their physiological strength that they possess without being much larger than a human. Descending down from the sky and drifting above Earth for a while, nobody really had a clue as to where these things hail from. But after following the story of Garrus and CJ for a while, we do get some information here and there about their homeworld. Their homeworld is apparently extremely far from Earth, even in galactic terms. In fact, it's hinted that they may not even be from the same galaxy, which does not bode well for human exploration of space if these creatures had to go that far just to run into Earth. Concerning their home planet itself, they apparently have 7 moons, which appears rather sizable. They also come from something known as a super Earth. A super Earth is basically a planet that appears within the habitable range of their parent star that could potentially support life, but it's much more massive than Earth, which you might wonder, why exactly is Earth so small then? Actually, fun fact, a super Earth may have been in the works in our solar system, which arguably would have made things more difficult for life as we know it today and our attempts to leave Earth. But through protoplanetary collisions and tidal forces forces enacted on the inner solar system brought on by Saturn swinging out past Jupiter and Jupiter staying where it was, this caused the protoplanetary disk to stratify more and keep the planets smaller in the inner system, because actually super Earths are more common than our planet being our size. So this in turn may actually kind of inform you of how lucky we are. Jupiter acts as a planetary guard for the inner solar system, keeping asteroids from just routinely wrecking every world here, and also stop the formation of a super Earth. So don't forget to thank Jupiter for being an absolute baller. Anyhow, our own solar system potential history aside, a super Earth presents many challenges physically for a species, and then it presents many challenges every step of the way concerning technological progress for a species, which we see both displayed in how the prawns operate on Earth and how capable their technology is as well. A super Earth would have more gravity, but much less than you might imagine, and it really comes down to how dense the planet actually is. So this might kind of fly in the face of what we would expect, and probably what you would think, but here's how the gravity works out. There is a planet known as HD 40301G. Its mass is 8.2 Earths with a radius of 2.4 times that of Earth's. Using a formula, surface gravity equals mass divided by a radius squared, you actually get a surface gravity of 1.42 times that of Earth. This means that you would absolutely be heavier if you lived there long term, and your joints would start wearing out around your mid-20s rather than your 40s, but still completely survivable by human standards. Now, for a species that lives there, physically this provides extra challenges to their meat suits in the same way it would our bodies. That extra pull means that extra weight would be heavier and would wear them down faster as it's amplified on their home planet, which we will get into the anatomy momentarily, but let's keep discussing their homeworld for a moment because that's always interesting. Now, seeing as it's a super Earth, again gravity would be higher, but seemingly they would need to also be similar to Earthlings in terms of metabolisms. Coming from their planet and still being able to breathe on our smaller world, this means that their atmospheric pressure would be similar to that, as well as the composition of that atmosphere being roughly 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen with 1% other gases. Now, I can hear you, and this happens every single time, as someone is bound to say it, nitrogen is not a gas that they can base their metabolism on. The reason for this is that oxygen is extremely reactive, and as a result, it can be combined with other atoms to create the necessary components to form energy-bearing molecules that can be utilized for cellular processes. Nitrogen is a noble gas and is largely inert, and this is because of the triple bond that it has. It is barely reactive to much of anything, and as a result, would make a terrible gas to base your metabolism on. Now, the counter to this is, oh, but Roanoke, they're aliens, and I totally get that, but the rules of if something is reactive, and again, considering nitrogen has triple bonds, it's just incredibly difficult for enzymes to actually break that, and that means it makes it difficult to survive. Not to mention, oxygen, because it is so reactive, would be toxic to a nitrogen-based organism if it were to land on Earth. I mean, oxygen toxicity exists on this planet right now in humans, which can cause lung damage if we even just breathe too much of the stuff naturally. So there are just too many context clues pointing that this is an oxygen-based metabolism rather than a nitrogen-based one. So moving on, with their technology, we also see many challenges presented on trying to leave their home planet. While the gravity wouldn't appear to be that big of a deal, being that it's hypothesized more, I would be inclined to believe that their gravity is actually more rather than less. Because if you take that same equation from earlier and made the planet bigger, eventually you reach a point where the gravity is actually less than that of Earth's because its density isn't keeping up with the size of the planet. Sort of like how Jupiter would actually float if placed in a giant ocean, but Earth would sink. Size doesn't mean higher gravity always. However, their anatomy and strength would suggest that they lived on a higher gravity world, which means when leaving their planet, their technology would also have to be better refined than ours, seeing as we contend with less gravity. This is displayed in their ship, as they actually have anti-gravity abilities rather than just pure propulsion that we rely on, seeing as it really did hover above Earth for over 2 decades. Okay, so enough planet rating, let's talk about the prawns. Now, the prawns are interesting for several reasons. Having come from this planet, which again, their adaptations definitely suggest a higher gravity world, the first thing I would like to note is their ability to leap great distances and move much faster than humans. The design of their body is one that definitely stems from extra weight placed on them, so before getting to the internal and a discussion over why I don't believe these creatures always look like this, let's first talk about their external morphology. Starting with the feet, these creatures have 3 main toes and a 4th toe on the sides, much like where our thumbs would be on our hands. This is highly interesting because it may suggest, much like our foot shape changed from a hand shape to our actual feet, this is what's happening with this species. This could suggest that they too were hanging out in trees and used all 4 limbs to grasp, much like we did back in the day. Of course, it should be noted that they actually have 6 limbs, so there is a 3rd pair of limbs, which we will get to. Pulling back, we see that they walk on the balls of their feet, but considering they have an exoskeleton, it is still in a similar manner to how digitigrade animals on Earth walk. They are, however, still fully upright. The benefit of walking upright with this leg structure would actually put less strain on the knees degrees than our knee orientation, leading to less breakdown in a higher gravity environment, and this would be invaluable. The carapace continues all the way over the whole leg and body, but moving up to the thighs, they are not much larger than the calves themselves, essentially the same size roughly all the way down, indicating not so much a large amount of muscle, but potentially a system of tendons pulling to absorb the forces adequately. Our bodies do something similar with our Achilles tendon when we run. It absorbs mechanical forces like a shock absorber and recoils, allowing us to walk and run quicker with less energy than say like a chimp walking upright whose Achilles is not shaped like ours. The pelvis of this creature is shaped actually much like a human pelvis would be, with less covering due to the much smaller abdominal area. The abdominal area really seems to house very few organs and may really just act as a bridge for the nervous system tissue to cross down into the lower extremities. It would appear to me that most of the organs would actually be contained within the thoracic area, judging by the size of the chest. And speaking of which, moving up to the chest, we see this creature has a smaller pair of arms that resides recessed within the chest and may actually be a leftover adaptation from their evolutionary history that hasn't quite gone away yet. Sort of like how humans have pinky fingers which may disappear in the future in a number of ways. The chest is quite large compared to the rest of the body, and extremities, much like with humans, a lot of critical components are housed in here, and so too with the prawns. Moving down to the arms, they are completely human shaped. On the forearm exists quills, and a carapace appears to be much sharper than the other parts of the body, which may be used for cutting up meat, which could still be a leftover adaptation. But we'll get to that a little later. For now, it just exists. The hands are long, and the prawns have 3 fingers total per hand, which is interesting as this detracts from the feet with the number of toes. Now, this isn't impossible. We actually see this with geckos. It's just not as common for the amount of toes to not match the amount of fingers. The fingers also appear to have a claw on each tip, which can be used to eviscerate. Moving up to the head of this creature, we can see it has predator roots. Forward-facing eyes do not always denote a predator, but typically it does. And considering this creature is a carnivore to the extreme degree, as it really only eats meat, we can surmise that it did in fact hunt on its home planet. To add to this, with its upright posture allowing for the brain to be better supported by the carapace, at least carapace now, which it may have not always been a carapace, this would mean that eating meat would allow the brain to grow quickly and allow them to become more intelligent. However, they do eat mostly raw meat. Their head is smooth with large eyes and actually have very large irises, and this may indicate that they were effective at hunting at both day and night. The irises would open up at night, allowing them to let in more light, and considering they had 7 moons, there may have been a lot of light reflecting onto the planet, and then they turn into pinpoints during the day, resulting in less acuity, but still an ability to move around during the day. Their mouths appear to be likened to like a small mandible with 2 central small trunk-like protrusions hanging down in the front, which appears to be how they actually speak their language by directing air. The carapace itself does appear to be the skull, which is easily broken by force multiplication. Moving into their internal anatomy, I'm going to explain the cat food obsession in a little bit, but their bodies would still have muscle like you or I, with key areas possessing likely more tendons needed to absorb forces exerted from their home planet. On our planet, however, by using these same tendons, this allows them to move faster, jump higher and further than we can. This would mean that in open confrontation, humanity would have their hands full with actually dealing with these creatures should they decide to invade. The prawns also need to have a circulatory system like humans do, which let's take a look at that for a moment, as it confirms several things. First, it confirms that they are oxygen-based organisms. The prawns have red blood and would have hemoglobin much like we have, which means they rely on iron from their diet, which is easily absorbed from the meat that they eat. But this iron is used to ferry oxygen around the body, not nitrogen. This also means that they have lungs similar to us as well, taking in oxygen, then handing it over to the circulatory system for it to reach every part of the body, which also indicates a similar atmospheric composition of their planet to us. And this also hints again that maybe they weren't always as they appear now. The circulatory system would also be critical for their brain development, seeing as for the tissue to be adequately saturated with oxygen, they need a way for it to reach all parts of the body, as simply taking in oxygen and letting it diffuse through their body is something that's no longer possible on Earth for the insects of this era due to the lower levels of oxygen than previously when the insects were gigantic. And speaking of brains, socially it would appear that again these creatures are much like humans. In fact, had they not become what they were, humans and prawns would have likely gotten along even in their altered form. And this does still appear to exist at least to some degree. Their social behaviors is seen as they care for their young and choose to exist in groups even if it's detrimental to the surrounding area. And this would indicate that in their more primitive days, they would have likely been a purely hunter society, seeing as they exist on only meat, and really there would be no need to gather. And this may be why they had to leave their planet. Now this is going to get into kind of Earth-like issues, but here we go. We as a species have developed farms for animals as well as plants, and this actually could be our downfall or saving factor depending on who you ask. Concerning our downfall, our fruits, vegetables, and grains are becoming less nutritional as we farm year after year and decade after decade and use up the resources in the soil. In In fact, we were becoming heavily reliant on synthetic fertilizer to put those nutrients back in the food. And this is presenting an interesting issue for humanity, as will we reach a point where our food is so depleted that we just really can't get what we need anymore? On top of this, the animal farms we have produce kind of a lot of gases, and this isn't a political stance, it's just a reality. Whether that's doing something to the atmosphere or not is just irrelevant to this conversation, but gases are being created. The flip side of this being our saving grace, because of the amount of farmland in the United States and how vast it is and how we use it, that has sucked up more CO2 than the rainforest and is only growing, meaning that every time we plant food, we are actually reversing a lot of issues. So, are plant farms offsetting animal farms considering how much greenhouse gases are being taken in? Again, possibly, but the comparison I'm drawing is that because we are omnivores, it's like a yin and yang scenario. With the prawns, seeing as they are pure carnivores and only interested in meat, likely vegetation was really not a concern of theirs, and because of this, they would go on to likely have animal farms, which would present its own challenges for them. This may be why they actually had to leave their planet to attempt to find other worlds in order to stabilize their own population and food issues. This would, however, result in what we have seen, which let's talk about that for a moment. So until we get District 9 to the Second Coming, which at this point has been almost 13 years, which means Garrus's promise of coming back in 3 years was just a total lie. That means we aren't 100% sure what happened to this species, but we can apply a few things considering what has happened to Vicus and a few context clues. First and foremost, I don't believe these creatures always look like this. Let's talk about how they show up to Earth in the first place, as both of these things are related. Clearly, they have a pretty fair grasp and understanding on spaceflight and how to operate their ship. However, shortly after just sort of listing into Earth's atmosphere, they sort of stayed on their ship until humans literally had to cut into the hull. Upon doing so, the creatures were malnourished and in general didn't know what was going on. So it seems a little strange, doesn't it? How does a species just completely forget about how everything works and why are they even there? Upon being brought back down to Earth, they just sort of seem to exist with really no purpose, despite appearing like an extremely intelligent species. They just do not understand or display an understanding of why they are here or what they are even doing. Very few appear to have a desire to return back home, as no attempts are made by a large majority of them except by Garrus and his buddy. We do, however, see that CJ has an intellect that appears far beyond what most of them around him is, and likely more on par with what his species originally was. Not only does he have a firm grasp on his own technology, but he appears to understand alien languages despite having just recently emerged from an egg. And this says to me something else is going on with the adults of his species that might not be Earth related. A case could be made that after coming down to Earth, something was up with the prawns. Possibly it could have been Earth's atmosphere affecting their ability to think, or maybe it was our food interacting with unknown ways in their physiology, leading them to some sort of nutrient deficit, causing them to behave more animalistic. But if this was the case, then CJ would also exhibit these same traits, as he's been exposed to the same factors, as well as Garrus having the same issues. Yet they seem more conscious and aware than many of the other aggressive prawns. So why is this? Well, I believe this is a disease, but one that the prawns are already aware of, but something has happened. The ship would not have been built, piloted, and maintained by prawns that we see in District 9. Instead, they are simply a shell of their former selves. Something had to have happened to cause them to behave like this. Seeing what has happened to Vicus and his subsequent change to a prawn himself, I would propose that the species looked entirely different and behaved differently upon entering their ship and leaving their home planet and then arriving to Earth, which means something happened along the way. We know that technology itself is outside of our current understanding, considering Vicus got sprayed in the face, which ultimately turned him into a prawn-like insect with a humanoid shape. But I kind of feel like there's a point to all this. So here's what I think happened. When they cut open the ship, nothing was working. Like, the ship itself was on life support, and this is after the ship fell to Earth, or the little smaller ship. Inside that ship was Garrus, and that's why his shack is built over that ship, and that's why he knew exactly where it was, as he's been working on restoring it for over 20 years. The others that were inside the ship were not so fortunate. I think all of them were exposed to the same liquid, which altered their original form. Think of it like with our tech being exposed to nuclear radiation by jumping into a cooling tank of a fission reactor. You would be exposed to a fair amount of radiation, which would alter your DNA, leading to cancers and illnesses down the road. The longer you are exposed to it, the worse it would get. The same concept with alien technology. Those that were stuck on the ship were exposed to this fluid for longer than Garrus was. As a result, their issues became more severe, which left them with a decreased mental capacity the longer that they stayed in there. Had humanity actually acted quicker, then likely we would have been dealing with all prawns on a Garrus level and could have actually come to an understanding. Whereas because we waited 3 months and just expected them to come out, by then their mental faculties were severely compromised, leaving just Garrus to get things working, as he would return home to get help. So what does this mean for this species? Well, I think this can be described described in one idea: insects. Did you happen to see the insectoid creatures fighting in the pit of the gambling ring? It's pretty interesting how everything is insectoid, even when it comes to humans being exposed to that technology, isn't it? Well, to me, this clearly shows that something with the alien tech physically causes your body to almost regress. This may mean a few things. First, it could mean that Earth and prawn homeworld had a very similar level in terms of evolution, meaning that insects were quite prevalent from the start. Because of this evolutionary pathway, the alien tech will regress your body back to an insectoid appearance, but you still maintain your overall humanoid form. And this is why those smaller creatures also appear like insects but do not have a humanoid form, because they never had a humanoid form to begin with. And this is why Vicus was turned into a prawn but maintained his mental faculties, because he was exposed to very little amounts of that fluid. The second possibility is that the actual fluid somehow contains instructions for the prawn species to be encoded into DNA, or contains something to be encoded in the DNA. And this may be a bleed over effect, but considering all their technology is biolinked, potentially the DNA would need to be altered to a degree to allow for the prawn to operate their own technology. When a human was exposed to it, it changed their appearance like it did with the prawns who were exposed. But the original intention of the DNA alteration was to allow access to the technology, sort of like how altering the coding in the integument system to allow for a new receptor to be formed, which would allow for the machine to interface with the body and even work in the first place. However, it seems like this process went awry at some point. Using the biolink as the basis for why it all went to crap, the outward appearance of the prawn was severely altered by this technology, and the longer they were exposed to it, the deeper it would enter the body before ultimately changing the internal anatomy to the external anatomy, decreasing the functionality of the brain in some ways, leading to more aggressive, less intelligent prawns, unless you escape the exposure like Garrus did, which would also explain the preservation of self and intellect within Vicus. This could also explain why CJ was seemingly more intelligent, as he was literally the next generation of prawn, meaning that his exposure was more secondary. And this is also why they know how to literally fix what's happening, because this might just be a well-known thing that, oh, if you get exposed to this liquid, you're going to turn into this. Our medical machines can reverse it. But this would ultimately mean that the prawns didn't look like this when they were in their ship at the start, but at some point they had what you could call a reactor breach, which is something like a human ship in the future could have. Once the material began to be released, no part of the ship was untouched, which led to the alteration of the original species and any pet species that may have been on the ship, like the two insectoids that we saw fighting in the pit. Once Garrus dropped off the ship and hid, the others would be found in a severely altered state due to exposure time. Upon returning back to his home planet, the machines there, again, could very well fix Garrus, but it's a gamble because upon getting onto that ship once more, this may ultimately change how he would be, as he's being exposed to the same material that has altered this people. And this is also why humans were able to escape this effect, as when they entered the ship with their suits on, this protected them. So to wrap this up, what's the deal with the cat food? Well, I told you I would tell you. Cats are carnivores, purely carnivores. So if you think you can make a cat vegan, I've got bad news. Because cats are purely carnivores, they need enzymes more so than humans and dogs. In fact, if you feed a cat only dog food, it will have severe issues. One of these enzymes in particular is known as protease, which helps break down proteins. In cats, they eat raw meat, or really, I mean, my cats eat cat food, but in nature, cats eat raw meat, which is typically where protease is found, which tracks with why the prawns still eat raw meat as well. But in a lot of cat foods, protease is an additive, because after cooking the food, protease is destroyed. So by adding it, the cat does have the ability to produce its own protease, but they can also strike a balance of them getting it from their diet. The same goes with the prawns. They are obsessed with cat food because, remember, they have almost reverted back to being basic animals. By eating cat food, they receive this extra nutrient, probably more so than just with meat itself, which may actually help them feel better when eating. Considering they eat a lot of meat and are always appearing hungry, they would need this enzyme to help them properly digest their meal. Upon receiving the cat food, their hunger is fully satiated, and as a result, they get a burst of what their species comparison to dopamine might be, making them almost addicted to this protease additive. Basically, they are starving, even when they're eating, but by eating cat food, they feel full for a time, as their bodies more readily break down the meat, and they are able to consume it more effectively, as they might not actually even produce protease that they need at all.